Okay, just want to give a very short introduction about the Critical Policy Study Network, which is kind of the arm length of the Critical Policy Study Journal, which now I responsible for the review editor kind of task that I contribute to the journal at the moment. And our initiative is that we want to create the network of the critical policy scholars through the essential books and even the journal articles that clearly contribute to our field, and try to expand the audience of the critical policy study journal from kind of the paper that you can download from the platform, form of platform that might be based on university license. Apart from that, we want also want to reach out the general audience, especially graduate student, undergrad student who want to explore the general idea of critical policy study. That's why the network has been emerged and initiated mainly by the key editors of the critical policy studies journal, which Navdeep engaged so far as well. For the network, I would say that most of the material that we produce so far mostly dominate somehow by the Western scholars. So that's why I'm very happy that Preeti sent the email that she wants to contribute, and with the book that she circulate to us, is very interesting and clearly contribute to the field of critical policy studies. So that's why it's going to be the session that we try to create the Asian critical policy study network under the big umbrella of the International Critical Policy Study Network. So most of the discussion today, I try to connect to the one who from the Global South, especially when I read Preeti work and realized that she, I mean, not really explicitly, but implicitly, the book try to promote the decolonization of policy studies. And I think that's why our people from the non-Western context, the Global South, if we want to use that term, should have a chance to, have a dialogue together based on the book that Preeti wrote based on her dissertation. So I just want to make a very short introduction about our speaker, the main speaker today, Preeti Raghunath. She from Monash University in Malaysia right now, and her focus is on the critical media policy studies, especially by using kind of critical policy ethnography methods, and you can, I mean, everyone here can see from her works, and that's very interesting. And the topic for her talk today is a kind of to explore the public sphere, a type of public sphere, I would say. And the purpose of her works is to kind of offer the approach that she called deliberative policy ecology, which is very fresh and productive. And she try to kind of develop the approach based on the emancipatory politics. Yes, of course, that's why it rooted in the decolonization of policy studies, which try to go beyond the imperialism, which is very interesting. And she also tried to propose the approach, deliberative policy ecology, which is a kind of the bottom-up policy making and kind of the approach that work with what she called emotive rationality as a key logic. Very interesting. And the approach rely very much on understanding policy narratives, which is the core element of critical policy studies that we familiar with. So apart from PT, which is the key speaker today, we also have the discussants. First one, of course, Navdeep from India right now, but he is the editorial board of the Critical Policy Study Journal for a very long time, I would say. Yeah, he engaged very much to the journal and also the main conference that we organize, which is the Interpretive Policy Analysis Conference, which gonna skip this year, but the next year we're gonna organized again in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and that's is very good platform that we can come and see each other again next year. And we also have Sushmita as the assistant professor from the Future Media Institute in India right now. Welcome, Sushmita. We have Susan. Now she in Hong Kong, Hong Kong Baptist University. Okay, and we have Noe John Joseph Sacramento from Philippines. We have Phuntsho Wangdi from Bhutan, but now he live in Australia. We have Rodrigo Espinola from Argentina, the global south. Anyway, so I don't want to spend much time talking by myself, so I'm gonna leave the platform to PT. Please feel free to present your work, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. That's totally fine. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the introduction and also laying out the contours of my book. What I'll do right now is present my screen. Is this visible? Okay. Okay. So this is the title of my talk. Like Dr. Piyapong mentioned, I am going to be presenting the approach that emerged from the data of my research, and I'll get into the details of that. It is called the Deliberative Policy Ecology approach, and the larger ambit or the larger subfield, if you may, is critical media policy studies. A little bit about the contours of my work in terms of the context and the method. My work really has been, it's been about understanding policies and policy making for a strand of broadcast media, which is called community radio in South Asia. So the idea was to look at 4 South Asian countries and to understand the policy making for this strand of media in these 4 countries. I am, like I mentioned, located at the intersections of a few disciplines, in the sense that I am formally in the communication and media studies discipline, but I do draw on various ideas from public policy studies, mainly critical policy studies, but also ideas of grounded theory from the larger umbrella of sociology and its various strands. My method has been informed by ethnography. So it is the policy ethnography, and I make a case for using ethnographic methods to the study of policy in order to pave way for more bottom-up understandings of policy making and policy, in order to go beyond the policy document. The key argument is that while the policy document emerges and has been the formal approach to the study of policy, it seldom documents the many contestations, the quandaries, the everyday kind of negotiations that are a very key part of the policy process for any aspect of public policy studies. And the idea then was to try and go beyond the policy document to look at the various policy actors involved in the study of in the making of policy. In order to do that, I looked at a range of policy actors, including activists for community radio. So each of the rationale for choosing 4 countries of South Asia was because each of these countries have had very significant trajectories with activism and advocacy for community radio in South Asia. Unfortunately, of course, one is going by the formalized idea of South Asia, but I clearly recognize the fluidities that come with this conceptualization of South Asia. These 4 countries have had a number of commonalities in terms of the administrative setups that they currently have. This goes back, of course, to the colonial past, when certain administrative logics created certain systems and structures in place. For Nepal, which was not a colony of the British, the monarchy of Nepal had ongoing trade negotiations and transactions with the British, which also influenced the administrative setups in the country. So beyond Nepal, I have studied India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. So these are the 4 countries of the study. My approach to policy then is located in a post-positivist critical approach, where the idea is not to refi the policy document or the process itself or the people involved. It is very much to go beyond a positivist study, which sort of bestows the idea of what something should look like, primarily with the state. The idea was to open up the black box of policy studies to a range of policy actors, like I mentioned, including activists, advocates, international organizations, and multilateral donor agencies, states and governments, of course, including the federal structures and the unitary structures that each of these countries have in variation. So the idea was to really understand the messiness and the fluidities that are often missing from communication and media studies and public policy studies, where we try to define with certainty, but it seldom is the case on ground. This is just a quote from, this is just a reference from Communication and Media Studies, where Professor Das Friedman has spoken about how policy making is an important activity and aspect to be studied. And he has alluded to the idea of policy activism. So it comes from a logic of emancipatory politics. The idea is not to simply study the policy making that happens in boardrooms and ministerial chambers, in corporate boardrooms and ministerial chambers, but to try and look, the idea was to locate myself in these informal venues of policy making, like, for instance, track 2 dialogues, like spaces where conversations around among activists happen, to try and understand what are the bodies and what are the membership-driven organizations for community radio in these countries. What were the critical moments of pushing the policy envelope for community radio in these countries? So as you will see in the book, for instance, the chapters 4, 5, and 6 are clearly devoted to that kind of ethnographic engagement with a number of these instances and these moments of policy making, the contestations involved, how certain negotiations were made, what were the differences like, as much as what were the various kinds of conversations that and deliberations that happened in the policy space for community radio. I'll come back to the last 2 points later, where I talk about deliberation, but this is again to highlight the idea of deliberative sites. So when I wanted to study the policy making for community radio, and I wanted to go beyond looking at the policy document, it was important to embed myself in locations where policy making happens. And by policy making, I mean a lot of the informal conversations as well. So the key components of my study of the ethnography comprised participant observations, field notes, formal in-depth interviews, and informal conversations. So the formal in-depth interviews and informal conversations came to a tune of about a little more than 100 such conversations and interviews across these 4 countries. I was involved in a couple of initiatives towards policy making in India, particularly because of my location here in the country. And all of this gave me a lot of insight into the kind of conversations, the kind of epistemic vantage points from which a case for community radio was made through the policy process. And when activists and advocates started looking at this particular medium in the late it started in Sri Lanka in the late 1970s, but in the other parts of the South Asia, it was primarily in the early 1990s. And when they made a case for opening up of the media to private players, we have in parallel, we have the people making a case for something like community radio, which is essentially localized radio for people, for communities to broadcast. It serves as a site for their voices. It serves as a site for archiving cultures of orality. So the approach to community radio has been very diverse in terms of its epistemic engagement by various people in the community radio space. And all of that gets documented in those 3 chapters, which are 4, 5, and 6 of the book. Now, the key deliberative sites were basically prominent policy-making avenues in the capital cities of the countries that were studied. These included consultative meetings organized by the government, among other things. The next the kind of deliberative sites were seminars and conferences that brought together key actors involved in the negotiation of policies. The third was spaces of discussion and deliberation created by NGOs, INGOs, advocacy networks. And there was a digital ethnography component where the digital sites where archival data and conversations were happening around community radio. I was sort of embedded in those spaces to try and understand the histories, the multiple histories of community radio, and as well as the ongoing conversations and the discourses in which this kind of medium was being spoken about. In terms of the actors involved that I studied and spoke to, the study allowed for formal interviews and informal conversations with actors from diverse vantage points. These included former and current bureaucrats working with the ministries of communication and information and broadcasting, home affairs, where basically the various ministries involved with reference to this particular medium of community radio across these 4 countries. The next were the actors that make up the epistemic communities with respect to community radio in each of these countries. And these included individuals from bodies like the Community Radio Forum and the Community Radio Association of India, the Sri Lanka Development Journalists Forum, the Bangladesh Network of NGOs in Radio and Communication, the Association for Community Radio Broadcasters in Nepal, etc. So these were really advocacy and epistemic communities who were at the forefront of engaging with these bureaucrats, engaging with ministers, and making a case for this form of media through a couple of decades, if not more. I also spoke to representatives from organizations like the AMAC, which is the French acronym for the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, the UNESCO and UNICEF, which have had a very intimate connection with community radio in each of these countries and have been have been grant giving kind of agencies for community radio initiatives, the International Media Support, Internews, among others. I also spoke to researchers and observers who've studied the sector in order to somehow get an expert understanding of community radio and the trajectories. I did try to talk to media law experts, but at the time, India did not have an IPR policy. It was only, I think, in 2017 that it was promulgated. So, of course, I was trying to understand the intersection of this strand of media policy, which is community radio policy, with the other strands of media policy which impact it, like intellectual property rights, like copyright law, like the IT acts and policies of the land, which, I mean, if a community radio was broadcasting online, would the broadcast policy be, impacting it, or the IT policies and laws be impacting it? So these were some of the things I was trying to understand over, during this period of research, which started sometime, my fieldwork started in 2013 and it ended between 2016 and 2017. So it was a continuous engagement over a period of at least 3 years in each of these countries, and it involved travel and embedding myself in these locations. I also spoke to representatives of community radio stations, because when we think of policy, we do think of policy makers and the people at the higher level. Even when we think of expanding that ambit to policy activists, it is seldom people who are involved in the station itself that make it as policy actors. We don't consider them as policy actors, but the effort was to try and also look at them as policy actors, because they not only operationalize a nationally drawn policy at the station level, but their everyday workings within the ambit of these policies shape the output of these policies and the everyday workings of these policies. So it was very important to look at community radio stations. So I visited quite a few stations in each of these countries to understand how things operate at that ground level. I also spoke to NGOs and bodies who've been denied licenses, because it's important to understand who does the state allow to broadcast and who are the people who are not allowed to broadcast, and what is the logic in that. The sampling, basically it was through Snowball Sampling. I connected with a few key policy actors in a couple of conference venues, and then went on to meet other people through them. It was, the initial part was quite challenging, because I was a rank stranger in each of these other 3 countries. And it was really because of the goodwill of, some of the people that I connected with initially, that helped me reach out to the other people in that community radio space in each of these countries. I conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews with questionnaires tailor-made for each of the kinds of policy actors that I was interviewing, operationalizing broad thematic entry points, and to try and understand how they looked at community radio, what were their experiences like, etc. I'll skip all of that. But some of the key tenets really that guided my study were that the idea was to bring together an emic approach to the study of media policy, where it was through a policy ethnography, like I mentioned. The idea was to not to, a lot of the media studies scholarship, unfortunately, relies on technological determinism, where they look at technology in a very deterministic fashion as solving certain problems or as bringing about certain changes. The idea was to step back and take a non-media centric view, which in some ways is counterintuitive, but these authors, Brockler and Butker, make a very important case for doing this kind of work, where one does not reify the medium itself, but to be step back and look at the people and how they shape the medium, and how the medium is, of course it is influential, but there are a number of human processes around it. And the idea was to present a humanistic study towards that end. It is an endeavor, like Dr. Piyapong mentioned, in a decolonial reading of policy studies and practices, where the idea was to open up that space of policy making and the histories of writing policy, where a lot of times the dominant narrative is what gets fortified in any policy or governance study. And the idea was to piece together micro histories that are often left out of the dominant writing of policy histories, to bring in these nuanced, everyday kind of understanding. It was essentially an exercise in writing an inclusive history of policy making for community radio. Again, like I mentioned, a multiplicity of policy actors and venues. This, of course, is borrowing a little bit of theory from Deleuze and Guattari, where they talk about multiplicity, of course. But to draw on that understanding for policy studies was a very interesting exercise. And to put it into practice in terms of the methodological contours was a little challenging, but I think it was a very fruitful and a very educating endeavor. In terms of the normative stance, I do draw on the Frankfurt School in particular for its offerings of critical theory. I look at the four generations of Frankfurt School theorists, and it was an engaging. I mean, of course, Habermasian thought is absolutely critical, but there are, like the understanding of the struggle for recognition by Honeth, works by Rainer Faust. All of this, like you will see in chapter 7 of the book, has been very central to helping me synthesize some of the understandings and reflections from the field, and to bring to help contextualize it in terms of its normative kind of bent. One of the key things that I was struggling with was that, like I said, of course, you have structures and systems in place, and systemic accounts of policy making and subsystemic accounts are very important, and structural attributes exist. But for a multi-country study, which from a region which did not have the borders or national borders that mark it today, and where a lot of the borders are fluid, that's a whole separate kind of literature. But South Asia is then a very fluid kind of, it's a melange of various things, and it's a very fluid space. And the idea of South Asia, which some of the authors have written about, some of the scholars have written about, was a very interesting entry point to help understand spatiality and region. And therefore, all of this rendered the policy process itself very complex. When one brings in that amount of, when one recognizes multiplicity and pluralism, it warrants an understanding that goes beyond structural accounts and systemic accounts. And therefore, I was beginning to grapple with the idea of ecology. And therefore, in terms of its theoretical positioning, I was, because I think constructivism was very, very useful, because one goes beyond a realist account to understand how ideation happened, the ideational, and its interlinkage, of course, with the material, because the policy document emerges as a very material attribute to policy studies. But the ideational realm, where values and norms put forth by various policy actors across levels and across spaces, be it formal or informal, that engaging with that, constructivism allows you to do that. And therefore, it was very useful to draw on constructivist theories of policy making from literature, from international relations, for instance. That was one, but constructivism has a shortcoming in the sense that while there exists a multiplicity of the ideational attributes of various policy actors, one has to continue to contend with these structures and systems, which are the real condition. For instance, when somebody was making a case for policy for community radio through a freedom of expression kind of a bent, or from a development kind of a plank, they were continuing to contend with a state which had a few priorities and structures of administrative setups which continue to shape and that is the space that one has to contend with when one negotiates. And therefore, the dialectics of reconciling these ideas and norms and values with the existing structures and systems and the larger context, just understanding this complexity, I was really looking at how is there a heuristic device that allows you to reconcile all of that and explain all of that, all of these negotiations and all of these tussles keeping in mind the contextual attributes. How does one do that? And when I was looking for such for lack of a better word, an inclusive heuristic device, I was looking at various policy architectures that have been drawn up by public policy scholars, by scholars who've written on human rights, etc. And they look at, I mean, the chapter 2 of the book has an analysis of these frameworks, which is the transnational advocacy network. For each of these frameworks, I've looked at the usefulness and I've tried to understand it from the data that I gathered from my fieldwork, from the ethnography, and to understand the usefulness and the shortcomings of each of these kinds of devices, the architectures of policy studies. Transnational advocacy networks, the advocacy coalition framework was quite useful, but of course it's a systemic account. So it was useful in helping me draw up subsystems, but understanding the shifting contours of systems over time, over like a couple of decades, when you had policies that changed the face of governance in each of these countries, how do you then account for changes in the systemic attributes of that where policy gets made? So, I mean, each of these architectures, like the epistemic communities framework or social movements theorizing, work on civil and political societies, for instance, each of it has its utilities, but it fell short of this ethnographic data. This ethnographic data, I mean, it was very difficult to sort of allude to one specific policy framework to explain all of that. So each of these helped me identify various strands that of the things that were happening in the policy making for community radio, but I was still unable to come up with one heuristic device that would explain all of that in some ways. And therefore, which is why I mean, a lot of the work is in the form of policy narratives. But then I moved on to understanding ecology and a little bit about how ecology has been described or written about across literature. From, I mean, mainly it is, again, a lot of the literature on political ecology or various other works, they look at ecology in terms of the larger environment in which policy making happens. However, the fluxes in the environment are seldom accounted for. And therefore, in order to go beyond the closed kind of a heuristic, I was looking at a more open and unbounded kind of heuristic that would allow me to account for these open and unbounded rationalities. For instance, when the idea of uncertainty that Beck talks about, how does one account for uncertainty which shakes up systems, which shakes up ecosystems, which makes it complicated over time? The entry and agency of newer policy actors, for instance, or the coming of new technology, especially for media studies, media technologies and their shifts. How does one account for that without alluding to these open and unbounded rationalities? So it was important to take into account all of that. And therefore, the idea of ecology has been very useful to help me synthesize these various policy architectures that I spoke about, cutting across various kinds of political systems. Now, each of these countries have their own political systems, despite having a common colonial past. They've moved on. It's been quite a few decades since the colonial times. The post-colony has been shaped by the colonial times, but has taken on a different, various diverse trajectories across these 7 or 8 decades. And how do you account for these differing political systems? The idea of ecology helps you do that. I'll come to Deliberation now, and the Handbook on Critical Policy Studies was absolutely useful, edited by Frank Fisher and others. Was very useful in terms of its offerings to help me locate the various negotiations in the policy space and look at deliberation as an epistemology. The Center for Deliberative Democracy at ANU, again, was the kind of work that they've done has been very, very useful. And also just the book on deliberative policy analysis has informed the way I've been able to analyze my ethnographic data. So it has been, it has been premised on intersubjectivities. A lot of times, even in spite of the fact that I was looking at contestations and negotiations, deliberation, like Mendoka says in the handbook on critical policy studies, and Selin writes about, it's often, we look at deliberation as a consensual kind of agreement on various problematics of the policy space. But deliberation is very much also a recognition of difference, and it is those differences that animate that policy space that allow you to account for deliberation. And therefore, it is very much premised on intersubjectivities, which are critical to address difference, power, and other concerns that the post-structuralists bring up in the policy process. Various other scholars like Mansbridge have looked at deliberation in various ways. From moving from a structural account, it has come to encompass the various informal kind of spaces, the everyday talk that happens in the policy ecology. So I've been able to qualify deliberation in certain ways. Deliberation does not mean agreement, or does it mean agreement, or does it respect difference? That was really something I was trying to grapple with from the data, because there were a few instances where even among the activists, you had a lot of differences, especially in their approach to community radio, in their negotiations with the state. A lot of times the state was offering SOPs, and a certain group would be ready to use that. They were looking at, of course, subverting the, those opportunities for to derive benefit for community radios. But a lot of times some other activists abstain, for instance. How do you account for these differences even among the activists for community radio? So all of this allowed me to look at deliberation and qualify it through my data. I won't get into the media ecology part because that is rooted in a particular kind of literature and media studies. But all of this is to argue and make a case for the deliberative policy ecology as an approach, where the policy ecology essentially houses the policy continuum, where and I think this is very key to the approach, where policy making is seen as an iterative process. It is a deliberative process it is a dialectical process emerging out of the constructions of various policy actors, of themselves and their stances, as well as the other stances. There is competing rhetoric and rationalities which are operationalized and operational in a particular spatio-temporal context, where the socio-economic, political, and cultural aspects all come in. So this really is the definition that allows you to make a case for the policy ecology as an iterative process. It is these iterations and reiterations that continue to figure in the instrumental aspect, which is the policy document, where you have amendments of the policy document based on newer contestations, newer actors, and newer negotiations through various kinds of efforts. So the idea is to go beyond Western philosophies to the study of policy, because the deliberative policy ecology approach is not limited to experiences of liberal democracies and their idea of democracy as seen from Western philosophy. It can be applied to the experiences of democratization and decolonization as it emerged in South Asia, and can be applied to various political systems where you have varying degrees of democratization. Therefore, of course, one draws on the Habermasian idea of communicative action. And all of this leads me to the concluding idea of the deliberative potential in a policy ecology. Any policy ecology can then be said to be, it's not, I don't make a prescriptive case for deliberation, but the idea is to make a study of deliberation by looking at how the deliberative potential emerges. For instance, certain contextual attributes often limit the deliberative potential of a policy ecology. are the interlocutors and the policy makers and the activists and the policy actors, how much are they able to deliberate? How much are they able to speak? What are the contextual attributes like? And what are the larger questions, like questions of power? What are the larger aspects like? Do we have an authoritarian regime? What are the cultures of governance like? How have they been formed historically? And how have they transformed over time? What are the current realities like? What are the relations between, say, a regime of governance and the way they perceive actors like activists and advocates? How open are they to something like international funding, for instance? So these are some of the questions that allows you to really animate this idea of the deliberative potential, which can then help us understand how deliberative or not deliberative a policy ecology is. And that is really, I mean, these are some of the things that emerge from the data. And I've been trying to share the theoretical kind of ruminations on what I call the deliberative policy ecology approach. I'll end my presentation here, and I'll be very happy to go into the details of the ethnography as well. I've not been able to share too much on the ethnographic data, but I wanted to use this opportunity, especially because it is the Critical Policy Studies Network. I wanted to use it to present the approach in a very, that was the idea. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Preeti. Then we're going to move to the discussion. You can raise some questions, or you can add something, or even make a critical reflection on the approach that Preeti shared to us. Could I start with Navdeep? Is that okay, Navdeep?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Piyapong, and Preeti, thank you so much for inviting me onto this panel. As I mentioned Preeti initially, I'm sort of not familiar with community radio. I've had a few interactions with people on the topic, but her study, of course, is something that was very interesting from a critical policy perspective. I've tried my best to read as much as I could. There were things that I was very interested in, particularly in knowing from the start, which was the backdrop of community radio in India and of media policies. And one of the things that I find that a couple of things that I want to talk about very briefly. I'd like, to hear from people who are actually specialists in the area. One is that I think that the study makes an important contribution, especially at this time, particularly because of, as Preeti has rightly mentioned, even in her book, the backdrop of the growth of right-wing populism. Yeah. And what is that doing to the notion of public communication? And what are the boundaries between public communication and propaganda? And the way in which we start understanding the multiple publics that are being both spoken to as well as are being constructed in the process of political / public communication. This sort of rise in right-wing populism, whether you look at the United States, you look at Europe, in some European countries, India as well, is in terms of media, there's the normalization of demagoguery, and there's a weakening belief in dissent and demonization of dissent and dissenters, and there's a kind of a normalizing force of the ideological foundations of a particular kind of far right regime. In that context, what are the possibilities that community radio offers? I think it's a very insightful view also of having taken 4 countries as and one, of course, I don't understand comparisons myself, the theory of comparative very well, but on the other hand, the bit that Preeti has sort of framed, which I find very interesting, is how do you decolonize our understanding of of um, of the way in which communication structures, public communication structures work. And what I found, I mean, I found your telling of the colonial state and the creation of, All India Radio in India, particularly. I was keen to understand how that came about, and that's also instructive for many other probably places and reasons where public communication and radio as a sort of an organ was used as educative. So the idea of educating a mass public and and what that term education actually meant was basically persuasion. And one of the things that you brought out very sharply, very interestingly, about the colonial, modern colonial state in India, was that it was deeply gendered, right? And it had these extremely, I mean, whether communities in India and whatever different kinds of patriarchies, paternalism may have existed or not, or different kinds of ways of thinking were existed, the British colonial state clearly focused on gendering social roles. And that, what you pointed out as part of the historical backdrop of radio, of an Indian national, of a nationalistic identity, which is created by this organ, was, I mean, really particularly interesting. So the archival work, when you bring that archival work into policy ethnography, and then explore the spaces that you have, for me, that really helps unpack a lot of things that somebody who doesn't have specialist knowledge can see, especially in the kind of backdrop that has been mentioned here. There's I'm not sure, but maybe there's this CG Swaranet, Chhattisgarh Swaranet, you've of course sort of come across, especially during the migrant crisis and the pandemic, and the kind of work that they did. So what it pointed out and how it links to sort of this the approach that you've used here. I mean, the way in which I saw this was was that there was a very strong, apart from dissent, apart from showing that what the state is communicating through the corporate media. Now, I'd say corporate media very sharply, because much of mainstream media, whether it's television, whether it's social media, is and even print media, is pretty much corporate media. It is, if not directly funded, if not directly owned by large corporations, it's indirectly sponsored by them through donations, through investment ventures and things like this. So if you look at this as a way in which we understand the platform, the corporate owned platform through which the state speaks, then community radio became an even more important, and the way you outlined it, for me to understand, I look at this example as a way to understand what you're saying, why it becomes more important, and it also becomes kind of an alternative, deliberative channel that allows, it's not so much of a deliberation as it confronting power in some way, and maybe then open channels of deliberation that are more productive for the way in which, and therefore, of course, the way in which policies control privacy, policies control these platforms become actually significantly important. You pointed out looking at seminars and conferences, and I think those venues, apart from pointing out actors, what what I read into that is also how those avenues actually help construct the very notion of who is credible and legitimate actor in the policy process, right? And then exclude others. So that's a very interesting place. Those are academic formats now used completely by corporate media owners or governmental entities in order to construct the very realm of policy making. And so there's a dynamic around that is significantly interesting there. Much of who becomes credible and legitimate is, of course, the information technology giants, and they have therefore then kind of reduced the possibility of others to engage in the creation of media. On the other hand, of course, we know that channels like YouTube have allowed indigenous peoples groups to voice their dissent, to voice their own cultural ways of communication. So that dynamic comes out really nicely. I mean, my understanding of of what you're doing comes through sort of this very layperson and this engagement with the actual stuff that it points to. So I'll stop with that. I mean, I just wanted to point out what I found interesting in what I could sort of read, and the contribution you made in this space where we are trying to decolonize critical policy studies. So it's not just a matter of saying that we are doing a study on India or South Asia and these things, but to actually show that the way in which colonial structures are working currently, right? In the context of the ideological politics of today, is what your study has contributed to. I think it's a fascinating contribution. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really want to express my gratitude to you, especially for making the time in the context that you mentioned at the Institute. And thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would like to kind of allow each discussion to reflect, and then Preeti, you can pick some points to address in the end. Is that okay?
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
so we're gonna move to Sushmita Pandit, please. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Preeti, for inviting me and making me a part of this panel. And definitely, we had a talk before also, and I told her that this particular book is very important in the sense that it kind of offers an avenue to understand media policy in the context of South Asia. There has been very little work, I'll say, in relation to theoretically understanding policy, media policy specifically, and media policy and the way it has been shaped in South Asia, specifically India. Um, uh, so Preeti has, as she pointed out in her presentation, that basically this particular book actually deals and offers an approach which is the deliberative policy ecology approach, which I think is a very important theoretical approach while considering any particular study which we do in case of media policy per se. Because of the kind of colonization that this particular region has gone through, and because of which when we look at the ways in which broadcasting policy has shaped up over the years, uh, we do find that um, that the shaping of the broadcasting policy also, as far as I understand, that has also been the result of some kind of um, it has been basically the result of the undependence on the factor of development, and how basically it can be used as a medium for the welfare of the state. And subsequently, after neoliberalism, this particular policy changes has occurred in the domain of broadcast per se, radio, television per se, and as we see that over the years, basically, uh, uh, because of the intermingling of the different technological mediums, because of digitalization, and because of the ways in which each of the mediums are kind of overlapping with each other, it has also become very important to understand uh, other factors, not only technological factors, but also to understand the actors who are playing a very important part in deliberating and in kind of preparing or somehow bringing the government or kind of influencing the major policy actors and the government to frame a particular policy. So I think Preeti's approach and Preeti's book kind of offers that particular avenue where she uses ethnography as a medium and talks to the actors not only in formal settings but also in informal places, and tries to understand the how the entire process of policy making is kind of complex. And because it is complex, that is why it is very difficult to kind of pinpoint what is it that has kind of resulted in a change in the policy making process. And also one thing that Preeti kind of mentioned in today itself, that is the kind of uncertainty that is actually shaping the policy sector. This is a very important point that basically, we as people looking into media policy issues, or looking into the ways in which the policy environment is kind of changing, specifically have to kind of take into consideration and try to understand that what is it and how the policy space is in a continuous kind of a flux. Because how can we make sense of this instability or instability that is going on in case of the policies that are coming up on a regular basis, or maybe the constant change or shifting or the shifts that is occurring in the policy spaces. This is also a very important point that we have to kind of keep in mind. And I think Preeti's book basically offers an approach through which actually we can to some extent make sense of it. So the thing is that it is basically it kind of offers us an avenue to kind of question the ways in which we kind of can understand the places or the spaces basically in which the deliberations take place, and how different actors are taking part in the process of deliberation, even from settings which are outside to the policy process. So basically, like the way, because when I read Preeti's work, I also did feel that somehow my work is also um, kind of, Preeti's work kind of helps my work also to make sense in a way in which the narratives that these people offer, who are the different stakeholders, how these narratives kind of differ from each other, and how it offers us a space to kind of understand the way in which they view or they understand their position in the policy making process, which is kind of very different from each other, and also in to some extent very similar, because of the fact that all these actors actually are to some extent playing an important role in shaping the policy or in understanding the policy. And I also do think, as is the case in the community radio policy sector also, that it is also to some extent the power play that is, there are some particular stakeholders who have the power to kind of influence the policy. And there is this kind of institutional arrangement through which basically this power play comes into forefront. So basically, apart from the way in which media policy studies is shaping up, apart from the technology which has been cited as um, one of the important reasons for which a policy change occurs, specifically in the field of broadcasting policy and other policies related to maybe digitalization. But apart from that, there is also the context of power, which actually helps or dominates the policy sector in case of media. Who has how much of power to influence, and the way in which they kind of can lobby. But also, Preeti's book is important in a sense because of the way in which she shows the different different regions, and the way in which the community radio policy has shaped up in these regions, and the kind of work that she has done by going ahead and taking interviews and trying to understand their deliberations, and coming up with this innovative approach of deliberative media policy media sorry deliberative uh, media policy ecology studies that can actually be used to understand the ways in which this interconnectedness and the network nature of policy can actually work. So the conflicts and the conversations of the different actors actually is something that plays a very important role uh, in order to make sense of the way in which the policy related to media are being changing. And it offers us to question and to kind of interpret to certain extent the ways in which we can actually make sense of the continuous shift in media policies. As I already mentioned, there is always a shift that is kind of happening in case of policy. So it is difficult to grapple and understand what is going to happen the next day. But still, having an approach actually helps to make sense of the changes that occurs. I guess so. Preeti's contribution is kind of very important, and thank you, Preeti, for making this contribution in the field of media policy sector. Thank you.
Okay, and Susan, it's your turn, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Piyapong, and thank you, Preeti, for inviting me for this panel. I'll just point out, I mean, I'll be echoing most of what the other discussants have spoken already, but and also include a bit of my own thing. But I'll be reading out what what was striking to me while I was going through Preeti's work. So first of all, Preeti's work has been very engaging read in terms of the focus and the breadth it offers within the context of both policy studies and media studies. It very expertly pulls the focus of media studies, especially community media studies, into examining the intricacies of its own policy making processes. And it also pulls the focus of policy studies to focus on how policies are made in the context of media. Bringing together the histories and contexts of the processes in the South Asian region is not an easy exercise given the diversity of cultures, government regimes, histories, languages, policy contexts, etc., and etc., despite the common thread of post or coloniality. As a scholar of media policy, I found the focus of deliberative policy ecology approach very useful in the manner in which it brings deliberation into the center of policy analysis. This helps to, one, decenter the study of policies from the state as being the primary actor to the actors and the context within which the community radio policies were developed in the countries of Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, and Bangladesh. There's a very, very rich ethnographic engagement with the field, which included, as Preeti mentioned already, interviews with 100 respondents across the 4 countries. And this kind of helps the reader become familiar with the tapestry of the intricacies and very specific contexts in which the community radio policy was negotiated and renegotiated in these countries. The approach is very useful in providing a schema to factor in the different kinds of discourses, power structures, and the vast number of informal activities, actors, and sites that are part of policy-making processes in South Asia. Additionally, the focus on deliberation and deliberative sites also complements the very rich oral and informal culture of the region to go beyond the dominant positivist bent to the study of policy-making processes. It takes the reader beyond the state and the policy as a document to understand how historical contexts, deliberative sites, and multiple actors, whether it be state actors, non-state actors, or international actors, or even advocates who may be advocates and activists, and even non-actors in the sense that those who did not get the licenses were also studied, are involved directly or tangentially in the process of forming these policies. So these were very striking insights into study of media policy in the region. And rooted firmly in emancipatory politics and the bottom-up approach to study policymaking, this evaluates the evolution of community media within some of the most diverse media systems of the world. In the current context, this approach can be potentially very helpful in asking very pertinent questions in the context of rapidly evolving policy-making processes on digital media in the current politics of the South Asian region. And secondly, to push the boundaries a little bit further, I think it would be very interesting to explore further if and how this approach can be replicated in the study of commercial media, where the primary players would be industry interests, and how can one look for emancipatory politics when the role of capital and politics becomes paramount. I think that would be my contribution.
Okay, then we're gonna move to John, Sacramento.
Yes. Thank you so much, Preeti, for your discussion and for the book, a very interesting book. And I think your dissertation or your research project really offered a new perspective towards deliberative policy analysis and opened its doors to really exploring what other potentials does deliberative policy analysis can offer to not just in the public policy field, but also to other policies or other fields as well and disciplines. Yeah, I think I will be presenting a very general reflection about the book as much as I have read some of the parts. And also, I will be presenting a more specific interest towards your proposal, which is on the deliberative policy analysis ecology as an approach to deliberative policy analysis. Well, of course, primarily your attempt and contribution, which is very significant since it's focused more on the communication side of policy research, and it delineates on the importance of the non-state actors such as the media in the policy-making process, both national and international levels, which I think is truly and not just essential, but also both critical and crucial considerations, especially that the 21st century national and global politics demand legitimacy, participation, and involvement of media in quest for democratic, if not sound and people-oriented decisions and policy-making process. And I think this is also a very reflective point where my experience and my background and my context as well in the Philippines would really point out or focus into, since media is being challenged right now by a very authoritative kind of regime in the Philippine government. While media studies in relation to public policy is no longer new to research endeavors in the discipline, I definitely think that it is just to point out that in your work, you presented that working on contemporary studies on media policy demand for a decolonial experience that is beyond the purview and structured thought of the global North and Western ideas. And you have also articulately presented what is meant by media policy, how it is being highly technically defined, which I'm very interested in since I'm also focusing on the technocratic and the deliberative debates in policy analysis, and how this field of research has long been framed from a colonial point of view, and how academics and researchers have vested interest by limitedly looking into the technical side of the vast scope of media policy processes. The call for and the rise of critical media policy studies, as you pointed out, is but an attempt to transform media policy to expand its scope that involves an in-depth understanding of not just technical side of media policies, but also with vast consideration of many levels of processes, varieties of actors involved, context and cultural diversities, and normative assumption innate to the local or context-specific constructions. And I think it's also important to note here that in studying media policies is not distant to examining the communicative spaces that provides room for public deliberations and discourses that is a critical element in engaging the public in general and in providing room for the voiceless and the marginalized to raise their concerns. Interestingly, Preeti also articulated the role of community media, such as community radios, which reflects the diversity as to how societies have conceptually and theoretically defined such. And this then became your takeoff point of the study to further explore the deliberative political ecology approach as the core of the whole research endeavors. And at the same time, you underscored the theoretical landscape and underpinnings, which involves critical policy studies approach that has been a productive lens in examining the ontological and epistemological discourses surrounding the global and community media policy, specifically focusing on the case of the South Asia. Well, of course, the consideration of community radio is a part and parcel of community media and tools community media tools to intensify local people's participation, and is a productive consideration in looking the case of South Asia in articulating an in-depth analysis. Hence, the case also unveiled how community landscape over media towards how the local region interfaces with local global politics, and thus it also articulates that there are varied claims over culture, heterogeneity, and contestation over power and resources. And seemingly, the role of communication through community radios has essentially put forward the reclamation of spaces of the voiceless, the rights to communicate by the most marginalized, and also a genuine and authentic forms of policy process that integrates representation of the most vulnerable, if not neglected, groups and sectors of the society. Also, a crucial point, this platform has become an instrument towards representation of everyday realities, as well as for those who are underrepresented and voiceless. Seemingly, what is the crucial point, what is also crucial to point out here is the critical contribution that Preeti would want to add in the critical policy discourse. This is with careful consideration of the deliberative policy analysis approach in advancing critical media policy studies. And the work utilized how DPA can potentially, or the deliberative policy analysis can potentially contribute to the media policy-making process, challenge the technocratic traditions in policymaking, and also situating critical policy-making endeavors established from a bottom-up process and advancing DPA as instrumental towards unveiling actors' performance and interaction in the policy environment. And I think the studies take off point from the DPA discourse provided Preeti to critically establish the theoretical conceptual framework of a deliberative policy analysis ecology that in its main objective and aims is to provide a holistic and more in-depth understanding of critical issues that demand for the DPA approach to be instrumental in understanding and providing solutions to public problems of utmost concern. And what I have noticed and what I have noted from your work is that the importance of historiography that delve into the international geopolitics and media policy ecology with emphasis on post-colonial history, which is a very critical component as well. And essential consideration, realities in politics and ethnological moments in the post-colonies. Also, you also trace the local public sphere that outlines the initiation of community radios to local communities in quest of modernization. And how are the and also further, you also delve into the plural policy actors and their actions and the dynamics that has been established between different complex and overlapping roles of these actors that leads to clarifying ontological and epistemological elucidation of the whole community radius in the community media discourse. Notwithstanding, you also provided a thematic discussion on the conflicts and problems confronted in the policy-making process for the community media policies. Hence, the deliberative policy ecology approach that Preeti suggests does not only delimit to the process of deliberation from what has been used to be or to be utilized for and applied to in the long history of application and practical relevance of the deliberative traditions to policymaking. Importantly, the deliberative policy ecology that Preeti suggests, these are the important understandings that I got from your book. Is that it moves media policy in comparative media politics forward and beyond the Eurocentric components limited to the discussion of media democracy and civil societies. And also it explored the roles, it is directed to explore the roles of actors, venues, norms, narratives, and interests, as well as the intersection of local and national and global, and to unpack the complex layers of policy development in competent and lively fashion and providing holistic understanding of governance. And I think the only one curiosity that I would like to ask, or may I also ask for your opinion about this, is that I would like to raise from this critical, but also an important contribution to the DPA discourse. How can the deliberative policy ecology approach can be practically relevant towards understanding, or if not, also towards addressing complex public problems of immediate concerns? Okay, that will be all.
Okay. Thank you, John. You can address it in the end if you would like to, Preeti. Now, it seems to me that it's a bit late at night in Australia, right, Phuntsho? So please share your thought.
Thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Preeti, for your wonderful presentation. I thought as I was reading your book, skimming and scanning through, it was a huge task that you have taken to 4 countries, which are like geopolitically, socially, culturally, and economically very diverse. But you mentioned that they are bound by colonial past, except Nepal. But I believe they're a very huge country, actually. So as a student myself, when you took up this deliberative policy analysis or review project, what were some of the biggest challenges and the hurdles that you faced while taking up this project? The most stumbling blocks, and how did you overcome them? So that is one that I would like to ask. The other one is about, I would like to touch on the media ethics, or in other words, the morality in policy making. At the end of the day, a policy has to be good. That has to benefit the larger mass or the larger section of the society. And media, as the earlier discussants have pointed out, is very critical, especially at this age and day and age at this time. It supports governance, it supports economy, it supports livelihood, lives, or it can also break livelihoods, it can also break governments. So while media is, as Navdeep mentioned earlier, he talked about corporate media, supported mostly by economic needs, by market trends, by globalization. In other words, not only radio media, but also not only community radio, but also all other forms of media is influenced by the market forces and also by power politics. So in this context, where does the ethics or the morality stand in terms of policy making? It could be media policy making or any other policy making. So what does the experience tell us about that? So these are the 2 issues that I would like to raise. Thank you.
Okay, Rodrigo.
Okay.
Any point you want to add?
Yes, first I would like to
Please.
thanks Ajahn Piyapong for the invitation. Thanks Preeti for the book. And I will thank you for many things, more than for the theoretical knowledge that you give me. We are, me, Phuntsho and John, we are at the stage of our thesis. And I always was wondered to read a thesis kind of study, but I never find a kind of topic that I would appreciate to waste my time or to use my time reading, right? So it was a great opportunity to sample what a thesis might be or how deep you should be in order to propose something interesting as you did it. And congratulations for that. Everything what I got from your book was already mostly highlighted, and in order to save our time, I would like to get more in the discussion on more philosophical, maybe, on how the different epistemologies that the technology itself has, right? Like television is not the same than a radio, right? It doesn't produce the same, it doesn't give you the same information, etc. So your meaning and your discourse is going to be different from a narrative. How the approach can play with those, be useful, right? In order to analyze or in order to create policy for media from the different perspective that each media has as epistemology, right? And the second is, if we have time to discuss it, why you propose there that deliberation is an epistemology, based on what I believe, like Platonic sense of idea of knowledge. I would say that the epistemology is, the ontology is when we get the knowledge, and we as a policymaker, right? We are using, I believe we use deliberation in order to get more information and more accurate down to up, bottom to up information, right? So let's say that we're using this. I would say that when we get to the shadows and all this reflection, as Platon explained in his definition. So, and then the beliefs, what people really think, and what are the feelings of the people. And then we get to the data, right? To the logic. And then we get to the idea finally to closer to reality. I know that we as a critical, we propose that closer to reality is the context, is the people. That's the reality, right? But I also believe that that should be our ontology in a way. You know what I mean? Like because if we treat deliberation as an epistemology, we will put it too up, and we will just deliberate when the idea of the policy is already defined, when the problem is already defined. But we don't go bottom with the deliberation. Is the policy in need? Is the policy, and media, for me, it's the fourth power, right? So, and it's very little where it's reading on media policy and study on media policy. And I think the power that media has in the world now with the post-truth and with the social media, etc., and the different epistemologies. So I would like you to, if we have time, of course, and you like to address, if not, we can keep a conversation by email if you're interested, how the different epistemologies are going to be weighted, or we just black box them and we say, okay, this is media and they should be like this. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and thanks for the invitation. And very nice to meet everybody, Susan, Sushmita, and Navdeep.
Okay, we have only 10 minutes. So Preeti, please just pick some points that you want to address, and you can also have a kind of a final words. Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for your wonderful comments. I mean, it is very heartening to see that all of you have engaged with my work to the extent that you have, and all your comments are very useful for me to take back as reflections and as feedback on my work while I develop this further as a possible, as an approach, but take it to other realms as well. So all of your comments are very, very useful and very helpful. A couple of points that I want to reflect on is, firstly, the question that was put to me about the challenges and the stumbling blocks. I think the study was huge, and I didn't know when I imagined it. I was extremely idealistic, as one is when one starts the PhD. I was full of ideas and I was full of enthusiasm for what I wanted to do. And I think that drove me to travel to these countries and collect the kind of ethnographic data that I did. I think that those were, of course, challenging in the sense that, on very meager grants afforded to a PhD student, when one goes to these countries and through snowball sampling, when one is a rank stranger, like I mentioned, to try and contact people in government and outside government, across venues, across levels. It was quite challenging to do that. But I think the most challenging part, beyond the travels and also as a woman scholar, to travel to these countries at very short notice, contacting people and doing all of this alone and coming back with this kind of data, all of that was challenging. But the biggest challenge was sitting with the data and not knowing what turn to take. How does one make sense of it? I think that was the biggest challenge. Making sense of data is something that of course, there are very scientific ways to do it, But I mean, exploring that ethnographic insight calls for a very different kind of an engagement. When you're in the field, you're full of passion for what you do, and you conduct the field work and come back. But to retain that passion and to ensure that you're seeing the data for what it is, without, I mean, of course, one is political when one deals with the data, one has one's stances, but to see it for what it is in terms of how people are articulating their stances to policy, I think ensuring that that balance is met with, I think that was one of the biggest challenges. And the second was finding that heuristic device. I mean, sampling literature across disciplinary boundaries, and then trying to articulate something by drawing on a few of these offerings, but being unsatisfied and dissatisfied with the kind of, lack of explanation for what my data was articulating, and then drawing this together by making a theoretical argument. I think that was the biggest challenge. And I think that will continue to be a challenge, because I do want to take this approach further. Newer realities will animate this approach, and therefore it is an open-ended approach. And therefore, I hope to continue to synthesize it and keep it attuned to newer realities as we go along in the media space, but also in the larger kinds of contexts that we are talking about. So I think that was the challenging bit. The second aspect about morality in policy making, I think I'll connect this to the question on the epistemologies of technology that Rodrigo brought out. Community radio itself is one that is infused with a certain morality, in the sense that it is looked at as a third space, which is not corporate and which is not government driven. It is looked at as a space where you have articulations by people who are otherwise not part of the mainstream. And therefore, it is infused with that kind of morality as a medium itself. And therefore, when you extend that to the policy making space for that kind of medium, the people that I spoke to as policy actors were very passionate about this cause. They were, their idea of community radio was, of course, to challenge, hegemonic media and mainstream media, but also a lot of them spoke about how it gives voice to the voices. These were the common tropes. So, which is why the idea of the normative aspect of policy making becomes so important, because the medium that I studied itself was loaded with that kind of normativity in terms of the kinds of discourses that were coming up associated with it. So, which is why it becomes important to ensure that the articulations are reflected as is. So when I was writing it, it was very difficult for me to adjudicate. How does one write something like this? Do you take on the role of an adjudicator, where you say that this view is right and that view is wrong? How do you present your politics, but also not tamper with the politics of the people that you've interviewed? And therefore, my role becomes that of a travel guide in the book, because which is why the idea of policy narratives becomes important. I present narratives and I have an engagement with the narratives. I present conflicting views, and then I come back with my authorial voice to engage with those quotes and narratives. So I don't know if this answers your question, but the way I interpreted it is to understand the normativity of the technology, normativity of the policy process, and your role as an author, which then becomes very important in negotiating with these multiple normativities. How do you do that? I think that was one of the things that I was grappling with. About deliberation as an epistemology, and this is the last point I'll make. That's a very fascinating opening for a longer conversation, which I hope to have over email. I suggest, from my understanding at least, when I was writing this up, I look at the ecology and the continuum between the epistemology, the epistemology of deliberation. I look at the ecology as the ontology, where these ideational aspects of the deliberative process, of these deliberative moments, and the acts of speaking up and the acts of articulation and argumentation that form deliberation, they are epistemological premises because they are in multiplicity. and the ontology that they have to grapple with forms a larger ecology. And this is a continuum. I'm not reifying either. I'm not closing either. It is an opening that influences each other. So that is how I saw it. But I'll be very happy to engage on that, because I think it allows me to take the approach forward and maybe make it more nuanced and make an argument for it as an epistemology, or revise it. I wouldn't know, but I would be very interested in having that conversation.
Okay, we run out of the time. Before I ending the session, can anyone here help to make the book review of this book for the critical policy studies? We encourage the, I would say, new generation of critical policy scholars to do that. I mean, if you cannot make a decision today, but you can make it later, just send me an email. If you can do that, it's contain roughly 1,000 words of the book review. Okay, on behalf of the Critical Policy Study Network, I would like to thank everyone, especially Preeti for sure, for your contribution to the fruitful discussion today. The record will be edited and upload to the YouTube channel very soon. If you not yet subscribe, please do that. Okay, have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Great day.
Goodbye. Have a great evening.
See you. Thank you.